He thought he was in control, until the moment the entire system started watching him instead. The rain hadn't started yet, but the air felt heavy, like something was about to break. Streetlights humming softly above cracked pavement as people moved in quiet routines, unaware that within the next few minutes, everything would shift. Officer Daniel Brooks stood near his patrol car, posture rigid, eyes scanning with the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. It was worn like a second skin, built over years of never being questioned, never being challenged, and then he saw her. Ava Carter, walking calmly down the sidewalk, hands in her coat pockets, expression unreadable, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving with a quiet confidence that didn't match the way people usually walked under those lights. And something about that unsettled him, not enough to step back, but enough to step forward. "Hey, you," he called out, voice sharp enough to cut through the low murmur of the street. She stopped, slowly turning toward him, her face calm, her eyes steady, not defensive, not apologetic, just present, and that alone made his tone harden. "You got ID on you?" he asked, already closing the distance, already assuming the answer before she could speak. She reached into her pocket, not rushed, not nervous, just precise, like every movement had already been decided long before this moment. And as she handed it over, their fingers didn't touch, not even close. He glanced down, barely reading, more focused on her than the card, more focused on what he thought he saw, instead of what was actually there. "What are you doing around here?" he pressed, his voice carrying just enough for nearby strangers to slow down, to listen, to watch. Phone subtly lifting, attention shifting, the invisible circle forming around them. And Ava didn't react the way he expected. No frustration, no fear, just a quiet breath, like she was measuring something no one else could see. "Just walking," she said, simple, steady, and somehow that made everything worse, because calmness, in his world, looked like defiance, and defiance needed to be corrected. His jaw tightened. "You people always say that," he muttered, low but not low enough, the words hanging heavier than the air itself. And for a moment, everything seemed to slow, the sound of a passing car fading, the flicker of a streetlight, stretching longer than it should. Imagine standing there, being judged before you even speak, reduced before you even exist, and still choosing not to react. Ava's eyes didn't move from his, not challenging, not submitting, just waiting. And that was the moment something shifted, something subtle, almost invisible, a faint vibration against her wrist beneath the sleeve, a signal no one else noticed, not the crowd, not the officer, not even the man across the street who had started recording. But Ava felt it, and just for a fraction of a second, her gaze softened, not with fear, not with doubt, but with certainty, because this wasn't random, this wasn't chaos, this was timing, precise, controlled, unfolding exactly the way it was supposed to. And as Daniel reached for his radio, ready to escalate, ready to prove control, he had no idea that somewhere just beyond the edge of the street, engines had already gone silent, doors were already about to open, and the moment he thought he was defining was already defining him instead. Daniel Brooks did not notice the shift, not yet. His fingers brushed against his radio as he took a half step closer, closing the space between them like it belonged to him. Like everything in that moment belonged to him. "Turn around," he said, voice low and firm, already expecting compliance, already expecting the world to follow the same pattern it always had. But Ava Carter did not move, not immediately. Her shoulders stayed relaxed, her breathing steady, and for a brief second it almost looked like she was listening to something else entirely, something beyond him, beyond the street, beyond the quiet tension building in the air. "Is there a reason for this?" she asked, her tone even, controlled, not challenging, just precise. And that question alone tightened something in his chest, because it was not fear, it was not confusion, it was clarity, and clarity in a moment like this felt out of place. It felt wrong. The small crowd around them shifted again, a few more phones raised, a few more whispers cutting through the space. And Daniel could feel it, the attention, the eyes, the unspoken pressure to assert control, to prove that he was the one in charge. "Do not make this harder than it needs to be," he replied, louder now, sharper, as if volume alone could restore the balance he thought was slipping. But Ava still did not react the way he expected. No sudden movements, no raised voice, just that same steady gaze, and beneath the surface, another faint vibration, this time longer, more deliberate, a silent signal moving through layers no one else could see. Her thumb brushed lightly against the inside of her sleeve, subtle, almost invisible, a response without words. And somewhere beyond the intersection, a black vehicle slowed without headlights, blending into the dim edges of the street, unnoticed by everyone except the system already in motion. Last warning, Daniel said, reaching forward, his patience thinning, his certainty cracking just enough to turn into irritation. And still, Ava did not resist. She slowly turned, exactly as instructed, her movements controlled, deliberate, as if she was allowing the moment to happen rather than being forced into it. And that distinction, though invisible, changed everything, the cold metal of procedure. The routine he had repeated hundreds of times suddenly felt different, heavier, like it carried weight he did not understand. Imagine standing there, knowing something no one else knows, watching the pieces fall into place while the world around you believes it is still in control. Ava's eyes lifted slightly, not toward Daniel, but past him, just for a fraction of a second, enough to catch the reflection of movement in the dark glass of a storefront across the street. Doors opening, figures stepping out, silent, coordinated, precise. And then she looked back at him, calm as ever, as if nothing had changed, as if everything was exactly the same. But it was not anymore, because the moment Daniel believed he was securing control was the exact moment control had already shifted beyond him, beyond his badge, beyond his understanding, and somewhere in the distance, a radio that was not his came to life with a single, quiet command that would rewrite everything that followed. The command did not come from his radio, and that was the first thing that felt wrong. Daniel Brooks froze for half a second, just enough for doubt to slip in before he pushed it down, his grip tightening on routine, on protocol, on the version of reality he trusted. "Stay still," he said, more to himself than to her, as if repeating it could anchor the moment back into place. But the street no longer felt the same. The air shifted in a way that could not be explained. Conversations around them dropped into uneasy silence. Phones that had been raised now held steady, capturing something none of them fully understood yet. Ava Carter remained exactly where she was, hands positioned as instructed, posture calm. But her eyes were no longer on Daniel. They moved past him again, tracking something approaching with quiet precision. And this time Daniel noticed, not what she saw, but that she saw something at all. His head turned slightly, just enough to catch the reflection again, the dark outline of figures moving in sync, not rushing, not hesitating, just arriving. And suddenly the scene he thought he controlled felt smaller, like it had been placed inside something larger without his permission. A second voice cut through the air, clear, controlled, not loud but impossible to ignore. "Officer Brooks," it said, not through his radio, not from dispatch, but from behind him, close enough to feel, precise enough to command attention without force. He turned fully now, his posture shifting, not defensive, not yet, but uncertain, and what he saw did not match anything he expected. Men and women in dark uniforms, no visible insignia, no unnecessary movement, just presence, coordinated and deliberate. One of them stepped forward, holding a small device near his chest, its screen glowing faintly in the dim light. "Release her," the voice said again, calm, steady, not a request, not a threat, just a statement that assumed it would be followed. And for the first time that night, Daniel hesitated, not because he was afraid, but because the script had broken. The lines he knew were gone, replaced by something he did not recognize. "This is an active stop," he replied, his voice firmer now, reaching for authority, for structure, for anything that made sense. But even as he spoke, the words felt thinner than they should have, like they were being weighed against something heavier, something already decided. Ava did not move, but a small breath escaped her, almost imperceptible, not relief, not tension, just timing, the kind of timing that comes when a clock reaches zero. Imagine standing there, watching a moment collapse in slow motion, knowing exactly when it will break, and knowing you will be the only one not surprised when it does. The agent in front of Daniel tilted the device slightly, just enough for him to see. Lines of authorization, clearance levels, identifiers that did not belong to his world, not local, not state, not anything he had ever handled before. And suddenly the badge on his chest felt smaller, not gone, but no longer enough. You are interfering with a classified federal operation. The voice continued, still calm, still controlled, but now carrying something else, something final. And behind them, more doors closed softly, more steps aligned, the perimeter forming. Without noise, without chaos, just precision. Ava lifted her chin slightly, her eyes returning to Daniel, steady as before, but now there was something new in them. Not power, not anger, just truth. And it landed heavier than anything he had heard that night. Because in that moment, without a single raised voice, without a single sudden move, the balance had shifted completely, and the realization began to settle in, slow and unavoidable, that he had never been the one in control at all. Daniel Brooks did not move right away, and that hesitation said more than anything he could have spoken. His hand hovered near his radio, but did not press it. His voice caught somewhere between authority and uncertainty, because the ground beneath him had shifted, and he could feel it now, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that made noise, but in a quiet, irreversible way that changed everything. "I need confirmation," he said finally, forcing the words out, trying to rebuild the structure he had always relied on, trying to turn this back into something procedural, something familiar. But the agent in front of him did not react, did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply held his position, calm and unmoved, as if confirmation had already been given long before Daniel ever stepped into this moment. And around them the street had gone still, the earlier whispers replaced by a silence that carried weight. People no longer shifted or murmured. They watched, sensing that whatever was unfolding was no longer ordinary. Ava Carter slowly lowered her hands. Not rushed, not abrupt, just controlled, like someone stepping out of a role that had already ended, and no one stopped her, not the agents, not the officer, not even the invisible rules that had governed the scene minutes ago. Daniel noticed that too, the way no one reacted, the way the world seemed to move around her instead of against her. And that realization pressed in harder than anything else, because it meant this was never about resistance, never about compliance. It was about timing, and he had missed it completely. The agent stepped closer now, not aggressively, just enough to shift the balance again. "Stand down, Officer Brooks," he repeated, and this time there was no room left in the words. No space to negotiate, no gap to fill with authority or assumption. It was final, and Daniel felt it, the weight of it settling into his chest, his shoulders, his breath. His eyes flicked briefly to Ava, searching for something, anything that made sense, but what he saw only made it clearer. She was not angry, not vindictive, not even relieved. She was steady, grounded, like someone who had seen this moment long before it arrived, and had already accepted how it would end. Imagine realizing that everything you believed you controlled was never yours to begin with, that the moment you thought you were leading was actually being led around you, piece by piece, step by step, without you ever noticing. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his posture in a way that felt unfamiliar, like letting go of something he had held onto for too long. His hand dropped from the radio, not out of defeat, but out of recognition, and as he stepped back, just a single step, it was enough to mark the change, enough to show that the line had moved, and he was no longer on the side he thought he was. The agents adjusted slightly, their formation shifting with quiet precision, not closing in, not escalating, just realigning to a reality that had now fully revealed itself. Ava took one small step forward, her presence calm but undeniable, and when she finally spoke, her voice was not loud, not forceful, but it carried through the silence with absolute clarity. "You were never stopping a threat," she said, her eyes meeting his for the last time. "You were stepping into one." And in that moment, without a single raised voice, without a single visible force, the truth settled over the street like a final answer, and Daniel Brooks understood, too late to change it, but just in time to feel it, that the story he thought he was writing had never been his at all. For a moment, no one spoke, not the agents, not the crowd, not even Daniel Brooks, because silence had taken over in a way that words could not compete with. It stretched across the street like something tangible, something heavy, And in that silence, the smallest movements began to matter, the slight shift of a foot, the quiet hum of an engine idling in the distance, the soft static from a radio that no longer belonged to him. Daniel stood there, his posture no longer rigid, no longer commanding. But not broken either, just changed, like a man who had stepped into a different version of reality without realizing it until it was already too late. His eyes moved across the scene, taking it in piece by piece, the formation of the agents, the way they communicated without speaking, the precision that required no explanation, and then back to Ava Carter, who now stood at the center of it all without trying to be, without needing to assert it, her presence alone reshaping the space around her. "What is this operation?" he asked, quieter now, not as a challenge, not as a demand, but as a question that came from somewhere deeper, somewhere that needed to understand. And Ava studied him for a brief second, not judging, not dismissing, just measuring, as if deciding how much of the truth he was ready to hear. "It is not about what you see," she said finally, her voice calm, steady, carrying none of the tension that had filled the air before. "It is about what has been happening long before you noticed." And those words did not come with anger. They came with clarity, the kind that does not need to be forced to be understood. Daniel's brow tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in realization, because something in that sentence connected to something he could not quite place, something familiar yet distant, like a detail he had overlooked too many times. Imagine standing there and realizing that the moment you thought was isolated was actually part of something much larger, something already in motion, something that did not begin with you and would not end with you. One of the agents stepped forward again, holding a thin tablet now, its screen casting a faint glow in the dim light. And for a brief second, Daniel saw it. Not clearly, not fully, but enough. Names, timestamps, locations, fragments of a pattern that stretched beyond a single stop on a quiet street, beyond a single officer, beyond a single night. And suddenly the question he had asked felt smaller than it had a moment ago. "This area has been under observation," the agent said, his tone still measured, still controlled, but now carrying a layer of finality that could not be ignored, for activity connected to an internal breach. And that word, breach, landed differently. It did not accuse, it did not explain, it simply existed. And in doing so, it shifted everything again. Daniel's eyes flicked back to Ava, searching again, but this time not for answers, for confirmation, and what he saw in her expression was not surprise, not satisfaction, just alignment, like everything was unfolding exactly as it was meant to, because it was, the street, the crowd, the moment. It had never been random, never been accidental. It had been a point on a timeline that had already been written, and as the agents adjusted once more, their movements quiet but purposeful, the perimeter no longer forming but holding, Ava took another step forward, not toward Daniel, but past him, as if the moment between them had already concluded, and for the first time since it began, Daniel did not try to stop her, did not reach, did not speak. He simply watched, understanding now that whatever this was, whatever it had always been, he had only ever been a part of it, never the one in control. And somewhere deep beneath the surface of that realization, something else began to take shape, something quieter, heavier, the beginning of a question he had never thought to ask before, not about her, not about them, but about himself. The question did not fade. It lingered, quiet but persistent, settling deeper into Daniel Brooks with every second that passed, not loud enough to demand attention, but strong enough that it could not be ignored. He watched as Ava Carter moved past him, her steps measured, unhurried, as if she was not leaving the scene but continuing through it. Like this moment was only one point in something far larger, and for the first time, Daniel did not try to define what he was seeing. He simply observed. The agents adjusted around her without instruction, their positions shifting in subtle coordination, not surrounding her, not protecting her in an obvious way, but aligning with her presence as if it was the center of everything. And that realization changed the way the entire street felt. What had once been a routine stop now revealed itself as something structured, something deliberate, something that had been unfolding long before he arrived. One of the agents spoke quietly into a device, his voice low but clear. relaying information that did not need to be explained to anyone outside their circle. And Daniel noticed something else, something even more unsettling. There was no urgency, no rush, no visible tension, just control, complete and steady. The kind of control that does not need to prove itself. Imagine standing in the middle of a moment that you thought you created, only to realize it was already designed before you stepped into it. That every reaction, every word, every decision had been anticipated, not to trap you, but because you were never the focus to begin with. Ava paused, briefly near the black vehicle, her hand brushing lightly against the door before it opened. And in that small motion, there was something intentional, something final, not dramatic, not symbolic, just precise, as if she was closing one chapter without needing to look back. Daniel took a step forward without realizing it, not to stop her, not to challenge, but because something inside him was still trying to catch up, still trying to understand the scale of what had just happened. Was I part of it? He asked, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them, not directed at anyone in particular, not demanding an answer, just existing in the open space between him and the truth he was beginning to see. The nearest agent glanced at him briefly, not with judgment, not with dismissal, but with a kind of neutrality that felt even heavier. Everyone on this street was part of it, the agent replied, calm and direct. The difference is who knew. And that answer did not explain everything, but it explained enough to shift the question Daniel had been holding into something else entirely, something more personal, something that could not be handed to him in a report or a command. Ava turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the moment without fully engaging it, her eyes meeting his one last time, not with authority, not with accusation, but with something far more unsettling, understanding, the kind that sees beyond a single action, beyond a single mistake, and into the pattern beneath it. And then she stepped into the vehicle, the door closing softly behind her, not with force, not with finality, but with quiet certainty. The agents began to disperse just as smoothly as they had arrived. No chaos, no lingering presence, just a gradual return of the street to what it had been, or at least what it appeared to be. The crowd shifted again, whispers returning, phones lowering, the moment dissolving in real time. But Daniel remained where he was, his posture still, his thoughts no longer anchored to the certainty he once carried, because now there was something else there, something that did not resolve itself easily, something that stayed, the realization that the line between control and illusion had never been as clear as he believed, and that the person he thought he had confronted was never the one being tested at all. The street slowly returned to motion, but something about it felt different now, like a stage after the curtain had dropped, the same setting, the same people, but the meaning had shifted in a way no one could quite explain. Daniel Brooks stood alone near his patrol car, the flashing lights now quieter, less dominant, as if even they understood the moment had passed. But for him, it had not passed at all, it had only begun. The echo of that single question stayed with him, not what happened, but why it happened the way it did, and more importantly, why he had not seen it coming. He looked down at his hands for a brief second, the same hands that had followed protocol, that had acted with certainty, that had never hesitated before, and yet now they felt unfamiliar, not because they had changed, but because his understanding of them had. Imagine realizing that the rules you trusted were only part of a much larger system, one you had never fully questioned, one you had never needed to see until it was placed directly in front of you. A quiet voice broke through his thoughts. You all right? It was another officer, one who had arrived too late to see the full picture, his tone casual, unaware, grounded in the normal rhythm of the job. And for a moment Daniel considered answering the way he always would, short, confident, controlled, but the words did not come, not in the same way. Yeah, he said finally, but it lacked the certainty it once carried. The other officer glanced toward the end of the street where the black vehicle had disappeared. What was that about? He asked, half curious, half dismissive, expecting a simple explanation, something that fit neatly into a report. But Daniel did not respond right away, because there was no simple explanation, not one that could fit into the structure he had relied on for years. Federal, he said after a pause, the word feeling both accurate and incomplete at the same time. The other officer nodded, already losing interest, already moving on. because for him, the moment had ended. It had not reached beyond the surface. But for Daniel, it had gone deeper, much deeper. The kind of depth that does not resolve itself quickly, the kind that stays with you long after the scene is cleared. He leaned slightly against the side of his car, his eyes drifting back to the spot where Ava had stood, replaying it, not the actions, but the details, the calm in her voice, the stillness in her posture, the way she never reacted the way he expected, and now he understood why. She had never been reacting at all. She had been waiting, not for him, but for everything else to align. And that realization carried a weight he could not ignore, because it meant the moment was never about control. It was about awareness, and he had been operating without it. Somewhere in the distance, traffic resumed. Engines passed. Conversations picked back up. The world continued as if nothing had happened. But Daniel remained still, caught between what he thought he knew and what he had just learned. And in that space, something began to shift, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else could see, but internally, quietly. The kind of shift that does not announce itself, but changes everything that comes after. Because for the first time in a long time, he was no longer certain, and that uncertainty, uncomfortable as it was, felt closer to the truth than anything he had held on to before. The night did not feel the same anymore. Even as the city tried to return to its rhythm, Daniel Brooks remained where he was for a few seconds longer than necessary, watching nothing in particular, yet seeing everything differently. The patrol lights reflected off the wet pavement in slow pulses, no longer urgent, no longer dominant, just present, like a reminder of what had just unraveled. He pushed himself off the side of the car and took a breath, deeper than usual, not out of exhaustion, but out of something harder to define, something closer to recalibration, because what he had experienced was not just a disruption. It was a correction, subtle but undeniable. He reached for his radio again, this time not to assert control, but to reconnect with something familiar, something structured. Dispatch. This is Brooks, he said, his voice steady, but different. Status on federal activity in my sector. There was a pause on the other end, longer than expected, filled with static that seemed louder than usual. And then the reply came. Controlled. Neutral. Unit Brooks, no. Active federal operations logged in your immediate grid. And for a second, that answer did not make sense. It did not match what he had just witnessed, what he had just felt unfold in real time. And that disconnect settled in quietly, deeper than any contradiction he had faced before. Imagine being told that what you just experienced does not officially exist, that the moment that shifted your understanding has no record, no confirmation, no place in the system you trust. Daniel lowered the radio slowly, his grip tightening just slightly, not in anger, but in realization, because now the pattern extended beyond the street, beyond the encounter, into the structure itself, the same structure he had relied on for years without question. He glanced around again. The crowd had thinned, the energy had dissipated, but something lingered beneath the surface, not visible, not audible, just present, like an echo that refused to fade. His partner approached from across the street, hands resting casually on his belt, unaware of the depth of what had just occurred. You good? He asked again, a little more curious this time. Daniel nodded, but the answer did not carry the same weight it used to. Yeah, he said, then paused. You ever feel like you missed something you were supposed to see? The question hung between them, unexpected, out of place. His partner shrugged lightly, half amused, half confused. Man, it is. A long shift happens all the time, he replied, brushing it off with the ease of someone who had not been part of the moment. And Daniel did not push further, because he understood now. Not everyone was meant to see it. Not everyone was meant to recognize it when it happened. And that difference mattered more than anything else. He turned back toward his car, but his movement slowed again as his eyes caught something small, almost invisible, near the edge of the curb, a faint mark, not paint, not debris, something precise, intentional, placed rather than left behind. He crouched slightly, just enough to look closer, and there it was, a symbol, subtle, nearly indistinguishable from the texture of the pavement, but unmistakable once seen, a mark that did not belong to the city, did not belong to any system he knew, but somehow felt connected to everything that had just unfolded. His breath steadied as he straightened back up, the realization settling deeper than before. This was never just an encounter, never just a misunderstanding. It was a fragment of something larger, something still in motion, and as he looked down the empty stretch of road where the vehicle had disappeared, one thought surfaced, clear and undeniable. This was not over, not even close, and whatever came next, he would not be able to see it the same way again. The symbol did not leave his mind. Even as Daniel Brooks stepped back into the driver's side of his patrol car, closing the door with a softer motion than usual, as if the night itself required a different kind of respect, the interior felt smaller somehow, more confined, like the space he had always operated in no longer fit the same way. He sat there for a moment without turning the engine on, his eyes drifting from the windshield to his reflection in the rearview mirror, and for the first time in a long time, he did not immediately recognize what he saw, not because his face had changed, but because the certainty behind it had. Imagine looking at yourself and realizing that the version of you that walked into a moment is not the same one sitting there now. That something subtle but permanent has shifted beneath the surface. He reached down and picked up his notepad, flipping it open to a blank page. The pen hovered for a second before touching paper, and when it did, he did not write a report. Not yet. Instead, he drew the symbol, carefully, deliberately, recreating every line as precisely as he remembered. And as the shape formed on the page, something about it felt familiar, not in a way he could place, but in a way that suggested it had crossed his path before, unnoticed, overlooked, dismissed as insignificant. His phone buzzed lightly in the cup holder, the sudden vibration breaking the stillness. He glanced down, expecting a routine notification, but the number on the screen was unfamiliar. No caller identification, no location, just a sequence of digits that meant nothing and everything at the same time. He hesitated, then answered, bringing it slowly to his ear. "Brooks," he said, his voice measured, controlled, but quieter than it had been earlier that night. There was a brief pause on the other end. Not static, not silence, but something in between, like someone deciding how much to say. And then a voice came through, calm, steady, unmistakably composed. "You saw more than you were supposed to." The voice said, not accusing, not threatening, just stating a fact. Daniel's grip on the phone tightened slightly, his eyes narrowing as his mind raced through possibilities, protocols, explanations that no longer felt sufficient. "Who is this?" he asked. But even as the words left his mouth, he already understood that the answer would not come the way he expected. The voice did not respond immediately, and when it did, it shifted the weight of the entire conversation. "That depends on what you decide to do next," it said, and those words did not offer clarity. They offered something else, responsibility, the kind that does not come with instructions, the kind that forces a choice. Daniel leaned back slightly in his seat, his gaze drifting again to the symbol on the page, the lines now sharper, more defined, as if drawing it had brought it closer to the surface. "I did my job," he said, more to himself than to the voice, trying to anchor himself to something solid, something familiar. But the response came quickly this time, cutting through that attempt with quiet precision. "That is exactly the problem," the voice replied, and for a moment, everything else faded. The street outside, the hum of distant traffic, even the sound of his own breathing, because those words landed deeper than anything else that night. They did not challenge his actions, they challenged his understanding. Imagine realizing that doing exactly what you were trained to do might be the very thing that kept you from seeing the truth. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, just long enough to let that thought settle, and when he opened them again, the reflection in the mirror looked the same, but the way he saw it had changed. The voice spoke once more, softer. Now, almost like a warning wrapped in calm. "If you start looking closer, you will not be able to stop." And then the line went dead. No click, no disconnect tone, just absence, leaving Daniel alone in the quiet interior of his car, the symbol on the page, and a choice he had not been prepared to make, not until now. The silence after the call felt louder than anything that had come before it. Daniel Brooks remained in the driver's seat, the phone still in his hand, the faint glow of the screen now gone, leaving only his reflection staring back at him through the darkened glass. And for a moment he did not move, not because he was frozen, but because something inside him was recalculating, piece by piece, the assumptions he had carried for years, The structure he had trusted without question, the belief that every situation could be understood if you followed the right steps. But tonight had broken that pattern, not violently, not dramatically, but with precision, with quiet certainty, and that made it harder to ignore. Imagine realizing that the system you rely on is not wrong, but incomplete, that there are layers you were never meant to see unless something forces you to look closer. Daniel slowly set the phone down, his eyes drifting again to the notepad resting on the center console, the symbol staring back at him like a question that refused to be answered. He picked it up once more, tracing the lines with his eyes, noticing details he had missed before, the slight asymmetry, the way one line extended just a fraction longer than the others, as if it pointed somewhere, as if it meant something beyond its shape. And then it clicked, not fully, not clearly, but enough to create a direction. He reached forward and turned the key, the engine coming to life with a low hum, steady and familiar. But this time it did not ground him the way it used to. It simply moved him forward. He pulled away from the curb slowly, his headlights cutting through the dim street as he retraced the path he had just walked, not physically, but mentally, step by step, word by word, looking for anything he had missed, anything that might connect the moment to something larger. The radio crackled softly beside him, dispatch cycling through routine updates, traffic, stops, minor calls, the normal rhythm of a city that had no idea what had just unfolded within it. And for a second, Daniel considered letting it all go, filing it away as something above his clearance, something not meant for him to understand, returning to the structure that had always guided him. But the words from the call echoed again, clear and unavoidable. If you start looking closer, you will not be able to stop. And that was the moment he realized the decision had already been made. Not consciously, not deliberately, but somewhere deeper, somewhere beyond logic, because he had already stepped beyond the line he could not see before. He slowed the car as he approached the intersection again, his eyes scanning the surroundings with a different kind of focus now, not just looking for threats or violations, but for patterns, for inconsistencies, for the things that did not quite fit. And then he saw it, not the symbol itself, but something connected to it. A small camera mounted higher than standard city placement, angled just slightly off from the expected field of view, subtle, intentional, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. His breath steadied as he parked the car along the curb once more, the engine still running, his gaze locked on that detail, because it confirmed what he had begun to suspect. This was not random. This was not isolated. It was infrastructure, layered, hidden in plain sight. And as he stepped out of the vehicle, again, the cool night air meeting him with the same quiet tension as before, one thought settled in with absolute clarity. Whatever he had stepped into was still active, still moving, and now, whether he was supposed to or not, he was part of it. The camera should not have been there, and that was the first thought that settled into Daniel Brooks as he stepped closer, his eyes narrowing slightly, not out of suspicion alone, but out of recognition, because something about its placement felt deliberate, calculated in a way that standard equipment never was. It was positioned just high enough to avoid casual notice, angled just enough to capture more than the street, more than the sidewalk, more than what any routine surveillance would require. And that detail alone shifted everything again. Imagine realizing that the moment you thought was over had been recorded from the very beginning, not for evidence, not for documentation, but for observation. Daniel glanced around instinctively, the street now quieter, almost empty, but no longer neutral. Every corner, every reflection in a window, every shadow cast by a streetlight suddenly carried the possibility of meaning, of intention. He took another step forward, just enough to stand beneath the camera's field of view, tilting his head, slightly as if that alone could change what it was seeing. And for a brief second, the thought crossed his mind. Was this still part of it? Or had he stepped into something else entirely? His radio crackled again, a routine call cutting through the tension, but he did not respond right away, because routine no longer held the same weight. Not after everything that had unfolded, not after the voice on the phone, not after the symbol, not after her, Ava Carter. Her presence still lingered in the space, not physically, but in the way the moment had been shaped around her, controlled without force, directed without noise. And that level of precision did not disappear when she left. It remained, embedded in the environment itself, Daniel reached up slightly, not touching the camera, just close enough to see its surface more clearly. There were no markings, no identifiers, nothing that tied it to a department, a contractor, or any system he could name, and that absence spoke louder than anything else, because in his world, everything had a label, everything had a place, but this did not, and that meant it existed outside the structure he understood. A faint sound behind him made him turn, not sudden, not alarming, just enough to shift his attention. A car passing slowly at the end of the block, its headlights dimmed, its movement steady, unremarkable, yet somehow it felt connected. Not because of what it did, but because of when it appeared, and Daniel felt it again. That subtle pull, that sense that the timing of everything was not random, that each piece, no matter how small, fit into something larger, something still unfolding. Imagine standing in a place where nothing looks unusual, yet everything feels intentional, where the absence of explanation becomes the explanation itself. He stepped back toward his patrol car, his mind no longer trying to resolve the moment, but to follow it, to understand its direction rather than its origin. And that shift, small as it was, changed the way he moved, the way he saw, the way he thought, because now he was not reacting, he was observing, not asserting control, but searching for it. And as he sat back into the driver's seat, leaving the door slightly open, the cool air brushing against his arm, his eyes remained fixed on the camera for one last second, not with confusion, not with doubt, but with recognition, because whatever this was, whatever it had always been, it had not ended when the vehicle drove away. It had simply moved, and now, without realizing it, so had he. The engine idled softly, but Daniel Brooks did not drive away. Not yet. His hand rested on the steering wheel, fingers still, his eyes fixed on the street ahead. Yet his focus was somewhere else entirely, somewhere deeper than the surface of what he could see, because the realization had already begun to settle, not all at once, not in a way that could be easily named, but in layers, quiet and steady, like something unfolding from within. Imagine reaching a point where the question is no longer what happened, but why you were there to see it. Why that moment? Why that place? Why you? And Daniel could not shake that thought. It followed him now, threading through everything he had observed, everything he had missed, everything he was just beginning to understand. The camera, the symbol, the call. Ava Carter. None of it existed in isolation. It connected, not in obvious ways, but in patterns that required attention, patience, something he had never needed before in quite this way. He exhaled slowly and reached for the radio again. But this time he did not call dispatch. He switched channels, cycling through frequencies that were not part of his normal routine, channels he had heard, mentioned but never used. Until now, static filled the car, low and constant, until suddenly, a voice broke through, faint but clear, not addressing him directly, but present. Unit 3 moving to secondary position. It said, calm, controlled, followed by another voice. Maintain observation, no engagement. And just like that, the pattern extended again. The confirmation he did not know he was looking for appeared in the most subtle way. These were not his units, not his channels, and yet he could hear them, because he had crossed into something else, something layered over the system he thought he knew. Daniel's grip on the radio tightened slightly as he listened, not interrupting, not responding, just absorbing, understanding that every word mattered now. Every detail could shift the picture further into focus. Imagine tuning into a conversation you were never meant to hear, realizing that the world around you is operating on levels you have never been trained to see, and that, once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. The voices continued, short, precise, efficient, no wasted words, no unnecessary emotion, just coordination, just movement. And then one phrase cut through everything else, sharper than the rest. Primary subject cleared the initial contact point. And Daniel felt it, the connection snapping into place, not fully, not completely, but enough to confirm what he had already begun to suspect. This was still happening, still unfolding. Ava had not just left the scene, she had transitioned through it, and whatever operation she was leading had not ended, it had advanced. His eyes shifted back to the street, scanning again, but now with a different understanding, not looking for what was wrong, but for what was aligned, what was intentional, what was part of the movement he could now barely perceive. And then, just for a second, he saw it. Not clearly, not directly, but in the reflection of a passing window, the same black vehicle, farther down the block, moving at a steady pace, controlled, unhurried, like everything else in this operation. And in that moment, Daniel understood something he could not ignore. This was not about catching up, not about stepping in, not about taking control. It was about recognizing that he had already been placed exactly where he needed to be, not as the authority, not as the decision-maker, but as the witness in that role. Quiet as it was, carried more weight than anything he had done before, because now he saw it. Not just the moment, not just the surface, but the system beneath it. And once you see that, there is no going back. The reflection faded as the black vehicle disappeared beyond the edge of the street. But Daniel Brooks did not follow it. Not with his car, not with his badge, because he understood now that this was never a chase, never a pursuit. It was something else entirely, something that did not require him to act, only to see. And that realization settled into him with a quiet weight that felt heavier than any command he had ever been given. The radio beside him went silent again, the voices gone as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind only the faint hum of the city returning to its rhythm. And for the first time that night, Daniel did not try to reconnect to it, did not reach for the familiar patterns of dispatch, reports, procedures. Instead, he sat there, still, present, aware. Imagine reaching the end of a moment and realizing it was never about resolution, but about revelation. That the purpose was not to change what happened, but to change how you see it. His eyes moved once more to the notepad resting on the console, the symbol still there, unchanged. Yet now it carried something different, not confusion, not curiosity, but meaning, a marker of the point where everything had shifted, where the line between what he thought he knew and what actually existed had finally been revealed. He picked it up slowly, closing the cover with a deliberate motion, not hiding it, not discarding it, but keeping it, as if acknowledging that this was something he would carry forward, not as evidence, not as proof, but as understanding. Outside, the streetlights flickered softly, casting long shadows that stretched and disappeared with each passing car. The world looked the same, but Daniel no longer saw it that way, because now he knew there were layers beneath it, systems within systems, movements that did not announce themselves, power that did not need to be seen to exist. And once you recognize that, once you truly see it, you cannot return to the simplicity of before. You cannot pretend that everything operates on the surface, because it does not. It never did. He leaned back slightly in his seat, his gaze steady, not searching anymore, not questioning, just observing, because that was his role now, whether he had chosen it or not. And in that stillness, one final thought settled in, clear, undeniable. The woman he had stopped was never the one being tested. She had known exactly where she was, exactly what was happening, exactly how it would unfold. And the only person who had been unaware, who had been moving without seeing, had been him. And that was the lesson, not spoken, not written, but understood, because sometimes the badge does not make you the authority in the moment. Sometimes it only reveals how much you have yet to understand. And as Daniel finally turned the key and pulled away from the curb, the city stretching out in front of him like it always had, one truth remained, quiet but permanent. He had stepped into something far bigger than himself. And whether he followed it or not, it had already changed him, because the night he thought he was enforcing the law was the night he realized the law had layers he had never seen. And somewhere in those layers, beyond the reach of what most people notice, was a different kind of control, a different kind of justice, one that does not announce itself, one that does not need permission, one that simply exists, waiting for the moment someone finally sees it.